So the question is, can we talk a little bit about biblical principles that should guide our discussion? And I love talking about that because I think foremost as Christians, we can talk about the economics and the politics of this issue, but ultimately it really is about biblical principles. And I'm not saying that the Bible, it doesn't support a bill or a legislation or anything like that. But I think there are certain principles that we can glean from Scripture that can help us inform our response, not just as individuals, but also as a church community and also as a country as well. So a couple of things. One of the first things that I noticed most about Scripture is that when you read from Genesis to Revelation, there's this theme of migration throughout the entire book. In fact, I feel like God uses migration for his redemptive purposes. And so whether it's the story of Abraham, who was called to leave his homeland, to the story of Ruth, who was a Moabite, who was a foreigner, to the story of even Paul, who was persecuted for his faith and called to move from one place to another. It says in Acts 17 that God determined the times and places that men should live. And he did this so that men could actually reach out to him and find him. And I feel like the reason even why immigrants are even coming into the United States is not because of even the political or economic reasons, but I actually feel like God's doing it for the renewal of the church. And the reason I say that is because when I go to so many different communities around the country, some of the most fastest growing ministries are among the immigrant community. And the reason for that is because a lot of them are actually coming into this country with vibrant faiths of their own, or they're coming here with a really terrible experience, having been a migrant or abused or exploited, and they come to this country open and eager to hear the good news. And so I think we as Christians have an opportunity to reach the nations for Christ, not by leaving our country, but by ministering to the people who God has brought right into our own communities. And I really think the missional strategy of the church has really flipped on its head, where we're able to reach people from every nation without ever having to leave this country. I think the United States is really unique in that we're the only country in the world where there is one resident from every nation around the world living within our borders. So we can literally reach every nation for Christ within the United States. And so I think this is a huge missional opportunity for the church. And it really gets to what it says in Revelation, where it says every nation, tribe, and tongue will be worshiping before God. And I think for us to see that within our community is huge, and it's going to be significant. But I also think this theme of shalom and welcoming the outsider, we oftentimes talk about the widow and the orphan as people who are really vulnerable, but we don't think about the stranger, about the immigrant. And these three people were oftentimes the people that God commanded us to care about because they didn't have family and they didn't have community to care for them. And right here in Bend, I am assuming that you probably have immigrants that you encounter on a day-to-day basis. And oftentimes I think we can look at someone who looks different than us and smells different and eats different food, and that discomfort creates in us judgment or fear. And yet God calls us, and Jesus specifically calls us, he says in Matthew 25, when you actually welcome the stranger, you're actually welcoming me. You're actually welcoming, Christ himself. And so I think even in those relationships, that there is a shalom that we can extend to the outsider, so they're not the outsider. And I think when we do that, we realize that in the story of the immigrant is actually a story about us. It's not about them. It's actually a story about us, because Jesus calls us in Philippians 3 that none of us are called to be citizens of this earth, that we're all called to be citizens of heaven. We're all sojourners going through this land. None of us are called to be here permanently, but we're all temporary residents of this land and even of this country. And so I think my ultimate hope is that, especially for all of us, I think we tend to think about immigration primarily as Americans. It's our patriotism, it's our freedom, it's our security. When I feel like we're not necessarily called to be responsive to this issue as Americans first, but as Christians first, and as Americans maybe even second or third. But, I think it's so important for all of us that we ground how we talk about immigrants, how we even talk about who they are or who we are as a country through these biblical themes of compassion and of welcome. And of really identifying in the immigrant a story of ourselves and of Christ himself. And so that's really my hope as we move forward. I think language is so important. All of us hear the news, and we're going to, immigration is going to be debated in Congress over the past, next probably 5 or 6 months. And so I really hope as you kind of read and hear about this news that you will really pray. I think prayer is the most important. praying for our elected officials that they would actually do the right thing and pass laws that will try to get the system right. But even praying for ourselves as a community, that we would be the people of God that would welcome these people. Because I do think that God has a great missional purpose behind the movement of people. And I think he can bless us through that if we see it as a blessing and not as a threat. And so that's really my hope as we move forward.